10:24 a.m., June 4th, 1942. Wade McCluskey's hands gripped the control stick of his Douglas Dauntless as he stared down through the clouds at something that defied all logic. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers steamed in perfect formation, 14,000 feet below his wings. Their decks were alive with activity, planes being fueled, bombs being loaded, crews scrambling in organized chaos. They had no idea he was watching. This moment shouldn't exist. For over 2 hours, McCluskey had led 32 dive bombers across empty Pacific waters, watching his fuel gauges sink toward the red while doubt gnawed at every pilot's mind. The Japanese fleet wasn't where it was supposed to be. His squadron had become separated from the rest of the attack force. Somewhere behind him, torpedo planes had already been massacred by Japanese fighters. The entire American assault was collapsing into disaster. 30 minutes ago, McCluskey had reached the point of decision. Turn back to the carriers while fuel remained, or keep hunting. He chose to hunt. And then he saw it. A single Japanese destroyer cutting through the water at full speed, leaving a white wake pointing northeast like an arrow. The Arashi racing to rejoin her fleet after depth charging an American submarine. McCluskey made a bet. He followed that wake. Now, as he prepared to dive, McCluskey understood he was looking at the beating heart of Japanese naval power, completely exposed, utterly vulnerable, and about to die. To understand what was about to happen, you need to grasp what Japan had become by the summer of 1942. Invincible. That's not propaganda. That's what the numbers screamed. In 6 months, Japanese forces had swallowed territory larger than all of Europe. Hong Kong fell in 18 days, Manila in 26. Singapore, the impregnable fortress, collapsed in 70 days. The British fled Malaya. The Dutch abandoned Indonesia. Americans retreated from the Philippines in humiliation. And leading this tsunami of conquest was the Kido Butai, the carrier striking force. These weren't just warships. They were instruments of devastation that had never tasted defeat. At Pearl Harbor, they'd gutted 5 American battleships in a single morning. They'd raided Darwin, Australia. They chased the British Eastern Fleet out of the Indian Ocean, sending the carrier HMS Hermes and 2 cruisers to the bottom. The pilots manning these carriers were the best in the world. Many had been fighting since China in 1937. They flew Mitsubishi Zeros that outclassed every Allied fighter in the Pacific. Their torpedo bombers could put a fish within feet of a moving target. Their dive bombers struck with surgical precision. These men didn't just train, they embodied Yamato Damashi, the spirit of Japan, the belief that will and dedication could overcome any material disadvantage. Japanese officers didn't just think they were better than the Americans, they knew it. Better trained, more experienced, more willing to die for victory. The American Navy had been a peacetime force playing at war games. Japan had been forged in combat. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, had designed the Midway operation to finish what he'd started. The plan was elegant in its ambition. While a diversionary force attacked the Aleutian Islands to the north, drawing American attention away, Yamamoto would unleash the full might of the Imperial Navy on Midway Atoll. The Americans would scramble to defend it. Their carriers would rush into the trap, and Japan would annihilate them. The numbers Yamamoto assembled were staggering. Over 200 ships, 4 fleet carriers, 2 light carriers, 11 battleships, including the Yamato, 72,000 tons of steel mounting 9 18-inch guns, the largest naval weapons ever built. 16 cruisers, 46 destroyers, 15 submarines. The 4 fleet carriers alone, Akage, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu carried 248 aircraft flown by the most experienced naval aviators on Earth. Against this armada, America could scrape together 3 carriers, 8 cruisers, 15 destroyers. One of those carriers, Yorktown, had been crippled at the Battle of Coral Sea a month earlier. She should have required 3 months in dry dock. Pearl Harbor mechanics had patched her together in 72 hours, barely combat-worthy, held together by determination and welding. The Americans were outnumbered, outgunned, and outclassed in every category but one. They knew the Japanese were coming. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team of cryptanalysts at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor had accomplished something extraordinary. They'd cracked the Japanese naval code. Not completely. Nobody breaks a military cipher completely, but enough. They knew the target, Midway. They knew the date, June 4th. They knew the composition of the Japanese force and their approach vector. Admiral Nimitz positioned his carriers northeast of Midway, hidden beyond the horizon, waiting. But knowing your enemy is coming doesn't guarantee you'll survive his arrival. June 4th dawned clear over the Pacific. The Japanese struck Midway first, sending waves of bombers to soften up the atoll's defenses before the invasion force landed. American planes rose to meet them and were torn apart. Marine fighters, hopelessly outmatched by Zeros, were shot from the sky. B-17 bombers attacked from high altitude, scoring exactly 0 hits. Marine dive bombers pressed their attacks with suicidal courage and were blown out of the air with suicidal results. Then came the torpedo bombers. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the carrier Hornet found the Japanese fleet first. 15 obsolete TBD Devastators lumbering and slow, without fighter escort. They attacked anyway. Japanese Zeros fell on them like wolves on sheep. The Devastators flew straight and level. They had to drop their torpedoes, while 20mm cannon shells tore them apart. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky with black bursts of death. All 15 planes were destroyed. 14 men died. Only 1 survived. Ensign George Gay floating in the Pacific in his life vest, watching the rest of the battle unfold around him. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise attacked next. 10 of 14 shot down. Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown. 10 of 12 destroyed. 41 American torpedo bombers attacked the Japanese carriers that morning. 35 were destroyed. 6 limped back to their ships. Not 1 torpedo hit its target. American torpedoes, plagued with defective depth triggers and contact exploders, either ran under their targets or slammed into hulls without detonating. On the bridge of the carrier Akagi, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, watched the American attacks with a mixture of contempt and respect. The courage of these men was undeniable, but their sacrifice seemed utterly futile. Not 1 carrier was damaged. The Americans were throwing away lives for nothing. But Fuchida was wrong. Those torpedo bombers had accomplished something crucial. They dragged the Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level. Dozens of Zero fighters swarmed low over the water, finishing off the last American torpedo planes, their pilots' attention locked on the immediate threat, blood singing with the thrill of easy kills. Nobody was watching the sky above.
At 10:20 a.m., Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the Japanese carrier force, gave the order to launch the counterattack. Japanese scouts had finally located the American fleet. Nagumo would destroy them now. On Akagi's flight deck, 36 aircraft sat ready, dive bombers and torpedo bombers, all armed, all fueled, engines warming. On Kaga, 30 planes waited. On Soryu, 21 more. 87 aircraft, enough to sink every American carrier in the Pacific. The big carriers turned into the wind. Launch operations would begin in 5 minutes. And then the dive bombers arrived. McCluskey's voice crackled over the radio. Attack. He rolled his Dauntless into a 70-degree dive at 10:24 a.m. Behind him, 31 more dive bombers pushed over and fell from the sky. They dropped at 260 miles per hour, howling down through the air, the wind screaming across their wings. The Japanese had no time to react. The anti-aircraft guns that had devastated the low-flying torpedo bombers couldn't elevate fast enough. The Zero fighters were miles away and thousands of feet too low, their pilots' heads still turned toward the water. The carriers, having just turned into the wind, couldn't maneuver. They were perfect targets. At 2,500 feet, the pilots released their bombs. 500-pound armor-piercing bombs with delayed fuses, designed to punch through a ship's deck before detonating. The bombs fell for 4 seconds. Those 4 seconds decided the war. 10:25 a.m. Kaga. The first bomb hit just behind the island's superstructure. The explosion detonated aviation fuel and armed bombs on the flight deck. A geyser of flame erupted skyward. A second bomb hit near the forward elevator. A third struck the port side. A fourth smashed into the bridge, killing Captain Jisaku Okada and most of his senior officers instantly. In 60 seconds, Kaga transformed from a powerful warship into a floating funeral pyre. 10:25 a.m. Akagi. Lieutenant Richard Best had been diving on Kaga when he realized almost every bomber was attacking the same target. He pulled his 2 wingmen out of their dives and banked hard toward the second carrier. His bomb hit exactly amidships, punching through the flight deck and exploding in the hangar deck below. The shockwave detonated torpedoes and bombs stored there. Secondary explosions ripped through the ship like a chain reaction, tearing bulkheads apart, igniting fires that spread faster than damage control teams could respond. Commander Fuchida, standing on Akagi's bridge, heard the scream of dive bombers seconds before impact. He looked up and saw 3 black shapes plummeting toward his ship. Then the world exploded. The deck lifted beneath his feet. Smoke and flame erupted from below. He turned and saw Kaga and Soryu also erupting in flames, 3 carriers burning simultaneously. The scene was, in his words, a vision of hell. 10:26 a.m. Soryu. Dive bombers from Yorktown, led by Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie, executed a perfect attack on the third carrier. 3 bombs hit in quick succession, the first near the forward elevator, the second amidships, the third aft. Aviation fuel ignited. Bombs and torpedoes exploded. Within minutes, Soryu was a blazing wreck, her crew scrambling to the rails to abandon ship. 10:29 a.m. The attack was over. 5 minutes. 3 Japanese fleet carriers mortally wounded. More than 240 aircraft destroyed on their decks or trapped in hangar bays below. Over 700 highly trained pilots and aircrew dead or dying in the flames. The destruction wasn't just material, it was institutional. These carriers represented 2/3 of Japan's fleet carrier force. The pilots who died couldn't be replaced. Japan had trained these men for years. They had combat experience stretching back to China in 1937. This wasn't equipment burning. This was irreplaceable expertise going up in flames. And the timing made it catastrophic. If the American attack had come 10 minutes earlier, most Japanese aircraft would still be in the hangar decks, somewhat protected. 10 minutes later, and most would have launched, leaving the decks relatively clear. But the dive bombers arrived at the worst moment. Every carrier's decked, packed with fully fueled, fully armed aircraft. The flight decks had become bomb magazines. Admiral Nagumo, shaken by the explosions, tried to maintain command from Akagi's bridge, but fires were spreading. Smoke choked the bridge. At 10:46 a.m., he climbed down a rope to escape the flames, transferring his flag to the cruiser Nagata. From there, he could only watch his striking force burn. On Akagi, Captain Taijiro Aoki refused to abandon his post, fighting desperately to save his ship. But the fires couldn't be contained. Explosions rocked the carrier as aviation fuel and ordnance detonated in chain reactions. The hangar deck became an inferno. Men trapped below died in the flames or leapt into the sea. 276 men perished aboard Akagi. Kaga's fate was similar. Multiple bomb hits created fires that overwhelmed damage control systems designed for single hits, not simultaneous catastrophic damage. Water mains ruptured. Power failed. Communications between decks died. Men fought fires with no water, no power, no coordination. The ship listed as water-flooded lower compartments. By afternoon, the order came to abandon ship. 811 men died aboard Kaga. Soryu suffered the fastest death. Her hull was thinner than the larger carriers. Fires burned through bulkheads more quickly. Captain Ryusaku Yamamoto refused to leave his ship. His executive officer begged him to abandon the burning carrier. He refused. He would go down with his command. At 7:13 p.m. on June 4th, Soryu rolled over and sank, taking Captain Yamamoto and 711 crewmen with her. One Japanese carrier remained, Hiryu. She'd been several miles north during the American attack and escaped the devastation. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi immediately prepared a counterstrike. At 10:50 a.m., while the other three carriers burned, Hiryu launched 18 dive bombers escorted by 6 Zeros. At 1:30 p.m., these aircraft found and attacked Yorktown, scoring 3 bomb hits that set her afire and knocked out her boilers. Hiryu launched a second strike at 2:30 p.m., 18 torpedo bombers. They found Yorktown at 2:45 p.m. and put 2 torpedoes into her. The damage was catastrophic. At 3 p.m., Captain Elliot Buckmaster ordered abandoned ship. The carrier that had been patched up in 72 hours was dead in the water. But American revenge was swift. Scout planes from Yorktown had located Hiryu before she died. At 5 p.m., dive bombers from Enterprise attacked Hiryu. 24 Dauntless bombers dove on the last Japanese carrier. 4 bombs hit. 2 near the forward elevator, 2 amidships. Fire started that quickly spread out of control. Aviation fuel ignited. The hangar deck became a mass of flames. By 6:30 p.m., Hiryu was burning out of control. Admiral Naguma refused to leave his flagship. He and Captain Tamiyokaku stayed on the burning carrier, choosing death over the dishonor of surviving defeat. At 2:30 a.m. on June 5th, Hiryu was scuttled by torpedoes from Japanese destroyers. Yamaguchi and Kaku went down with their ship, along with 392 officers and men. In one day of battle, Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, all veterans of Pearl Harbor. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu were gone. With them went 248 aircraft and approximately 3,000 men, including many of the Imperial Navy's most experienced pilots. The striking force that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months had been annihilated. The psychological impact shattered Japanese confidence. Officers who had believed their training and fighting spirit made them invincible now confronted reality. They'd conquered half the Pacific in 6 months, never defeated in a major engagement. And now, in one morning, an American, numerically inferior fleet had destroyed the core of their carrier force. Commander Fuchida, recovering from broken ankles aboard the destroyer that rescued him from Akagi, understood immediately. Japan had lost the war. Not the battle, the war. The margin of naval air superiority that had enabled Japan's conquests was gone. The experienced pilots who couldn't be replaced were dead. The carriers that required years to build were at the bottom of the Pacific. Japan would never recover from this single day.
The contrast with American losses was stark. The United States lost 1 carrier, Yorktown, that was already damaged. The destroyer Hamon was sunk by a Japanese submarine. Total aircraft losses, 147 planes. Total personnel losses, 307 men. The exchange ratio was catastrophic for Japan. 4 carriers for 1, 248 aircraft for 147, approximately 3,000 men for 307. But the real difference was industrial capacity. America could replace its losses. Japan could not. Yorktown was one of 7 American carriers in service. 2 more, Essex and Independence, would be commissioned before the end of 1942. By the end of 1943, the United States would commission 13 fleet carriers and 9 light carriers. By war's end, the U.S. Navy operated over 100 carriers of all types. Japan couldn't match this production. Japanese shipyards could build perhaps 1 carrier per year under ideal conditions. The industrial base was too small. Resources were limited. Skilled labor was insufficient. Japan had begun the war with 6 fleet carriers and 4 light carriers. After Midway, 4 fleet carriers were gone. The 2 damaged at Coral Sea wouldn't return to service for months. Japan's carrier force was crippled. The pilot losses were even more devastating. Japanese naval aviation training took years to produce combat-ready pilots. Standards were extremely high. Washout rates were severe. Japan had perhaps 1,500 highly trained carrier pilots at the war's start. After Midway, maybe 1,000 remained. And the training pipeline couldn't produce replacements fast enough. By 1944, Japanese carrier air groups would be filled with minimally trained pilots flying obsolete aircraft against American pilots with hundreds of hours of training in the most advanced aircraft in the world. Admiral Yamamoto, commanding from the battleship Yamato, hundreds of miles away, received news of the disaster in disbelief. He'd assembled over 100 ships for the Midway operation, the most powerful fleet Japan had ever sent to battle. He'd planned to annihilate American carriers. Instead, his carrier force was destroyed. At 2:55 a.m. on June 5th, Yamamoto issued the order to withdraw. The invasion fleet turned for home. The withdrawal was humiliating. The landing force that was supposed to occupy Midway never got close. The battleships that were supposed to bombard the island into submission never fired a shot. The submarines that were supposed to intercept American carriers were out of position. The diversionary attack on the Aleutians accomplished nothing except occupying 2 barren islands Japan would abandon a year later. American forces pursued. On June 6th, dive bombers found the heavy cruisers Mogami and Mikuma, which had collided during the chaotic night withdrawal. Mikuma was hit by 5 bombs and sank. Mogami survived but spent a year under repair. The Battle of Midway was over. The strategic consequences were immediate and permanent. Japan had lost the initiative. The conquests were finished. From June 4, 1942 onward, Japan would be on the defensive. Americans would choose where and when to attack. 2 months after Midway, American forces landed on Guadalcanal. The campaign lasted 6 months and drained Japanese air power even further. The carriers Shukaku and Zuikaku participated in battles around Guadalcanal. Both survived, but their air groups were decimated. By the end of the campaign, Japan had lost hundreds more pilots and aircraft. The decline was relentless. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, Japanese carrier aircraft attacked the American fleet in what U.S. pilots called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Over 300 Japanese aircraft were shot down in a single day. The pilots flying these missions had minimal training and experience. They flew into concentrated anti-aircraft fire and were intercepted by American fighters directed by radar. The slaughter was comprehensive. By October 1944, when the Japanese carrier force made its final appearance at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the carriers were empty shells. They carried few aircraft and had no experienced pilots to fly them. The carriers were used as decoys, sailing north to draw American attention while battleships attempted to attack invasion beaches. The decoy worked, but it made no difference. The carriers were sunk by American airstrikes. They had no aircraft to launch. The path from Midway to Japanese defeat was clear and inevitable. Without carrier air superiority, Japan couldn't defend its conquered territories. Without the territories, Japan couldn't access resources, especially oil, that sustained the war machine. Without resources, industrial production declined. Without production, the military couldn't replace losses. The spiral was irreversible. Lieutenant Commander McCluskey's decision to continue searching when fuel was running low, to follow the destroyer's wake, to attack at precisely the moment when Japanese carriers were most vulnerable, that decision set this spiral in motion. Admiral Nimitz later stated that McCluskey's judgment decided the fate of our carrier task force and our forces at Midway. Without that decision, without those 5 minutes of devastation at 10:24 a.m. on June 4th, the Pacific War might have lasted years longer. For the American pilots who participated, victory was bittersweet. Torpedo Squadron 8 had been annihilated. Torpedo Squadron 6 lost 10 of 14 aircraft. Torpedo Squadron 3 lost 10 of 12. Of 115 American aircraft that attacked Japanese carriers on June 4, 1942, 54 were lost. The cost of victory was high. But the survivors knew they'd accomplished something extraordinary. Lieutenant Commander McCluskey, wounded in the shoulder by Japanese fighters during his escape, made it back to Enterprise with less than 5 gallons of fuel remaining. Some pilots ran out of fuel and ditched in the ocean. 10 pilots from McCluskey's group were never found. But the survivors knew what they'd achieved. They'd destroyed the Japanese carrier striking force. They'd turned the tide of the Pacific War. The timing of the attack, that 5-minute window when all factors aligned, was both lucky and earned. Lucky that McCluskey spotted destroyer Arashi. Lucky that Japanese carriers were turning into the wind at exactly the wrong moment. Lucky that the combat air patrol was down at sea level. But the luck was earned through McCluskey's decision to continue searching, through torpedo bomber crews who sacrificed themselves to draw fighters low, through cryptographers who broke Japanese codes, through Admiral Nimitz who positioned carriers based on that intelligence. War correspondent Robert Sherritt later wrote that Midway was the most crucial battle of the Pacific War. More important than Guadalcanal, more important than Iwo Jima or Okinawa. Midway decided who would control the Pacific. After June 4, 1942, that question was settled. The United States would control the Pacific. Japan would fight a defensive war, losing battle after battle, island after island, until atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki forced surrender in August 1945. The dive bomber pilots who attacked Japanese carriers on June 4, 1942, couldn't have known they were participating in a hinge moment of history. They were focused on hitting targets, surviving anti-aircraft fire, making it back to their carriers. But historians would later recognize that these men in 5 minutes of combat accomplished what armies, fighting for years, could not. They broke the back of Japanese naval power. They shifted the momentum of the Pacific War. They created the conditions for Allied victory. Admiral Nimitz wrote that the war might have lasted 3 more years without victory at Midway. 3 more years of combat. 3 more years of losses. 3 more years of suffering. The Japanese pilots who died in flames aboard Akigi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu were as skilled and dedicated as any aviators in history. They'd trained for years. They had combat experience few could match. They'd executed flawless attacks on Pearl Harbor, Darwin, Ceylon. But on June 4, 1942, they were caught on their carrier's decks, unable to launch, unable to defend, unable to survive. Their skill and dedication couldn't save them from American bombs hitting at precisely the wrong moment. The 5 minutes that destroyed Japan's chance of winning began at 10:24 a.m. and ended at 10:29 a.m. In those 5 minutes, 3 aircraft carriers were fatally damaged. By day's end, all 4 Japanese carriers that attacked Pearl Harbor would be gone. The striking force that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months was annihilated. Lieutenant Commander McCluskey returned to Enterprise with 52 bullet holes in his plane, a wound in his shoulder, and almost no fuel. He'd made the most important tactical decision of the Pacific War. His choice to continue searching, to follow the destroyer's wake, to attack when opportunity presented itself, that choice changed history. He received the Navy Cross for his actions, but he never claimed to be a hero. He said he simply did his job. That modesty characterized the American response to Midway. The pilots who survived didn't boast. They mourned comrades who didn't return. They prepared for the next battle. They understood Midway was one victory in a long war. But it was the victory that made all subsequent victories possible. 5 minutes. 300 seconds. The time it takes to make coffee. The time it takes to walk a city block. The time it takes to change the world. At 10:24 a.m. on June 4, 1942, Japan still had a chance. At 10:29 a.m., that chance was gone, consumed by flames burning aboard 3 aircraft carriers in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The empire that had conquered half of Asia in 6 months would spend the next 3 years losing everything it had gained. And it all began with 5 minutes of bombs falling from the sky, hitting targets at precisely the right moment, delivered by pilots who were running out of fuel and hope, but refused to turn back. Sometimes in war, everything comes down to a single decision: a lone destroyer's wake, a pilot's choice to keep searching. 5 minutes when the impossible becomes inevitable. Japan entered those 5 minutes as a seemingly invincible empire. It emerged as a nation that had already lost the war. It just didn't know it yet.